Exclamation, everybody, and welcome back to some more code reviewing of the Open Vehicle project, Open Vehicular Epic project. Um, so the first three episodes, I believe it was, of this series, I actually had all recorded in one day. So there was no way for me to incorporate any feedback or anything from your comments because it was just one long continuous day that I did that in. But it is a brand new day, and it's been a few weeks since I last did any recording of this. I have done a few things, a little bit of playing around off camera to try to get some thoughts together. But I wanted to kind of touch upon a few things. These are not these videos. I was not really going for necessarily not necessarily going for a concise a concise look at what I'm doing. I'm trying to trying to edit as mercilessly as I can to get the videos down to some kind of reasonable length. But what as tends to happen is that I ramble a lot, and sometimes my ramblings are actually pretty useful to see. So it's hard, and sometimes it just to cut things out because I feel like they're actually useful to hear. The other thing is, I could very well edit this all down and just show you the thing that works, quote unquote. But I feel like there is utility in seeing me fail because I do fail often. I do go down blind alleys just as much as the next person. I do sometimes have the wrong idea about things, particularly with this project here where I'm code reviewing something that I don't actually fully understand myself. Normally when you're doing a code review, it's usually somebody who has worked on a system for years and is quite familiar with all the ins and outs of it and why certain decisions were made and everything else. I am going in completely blind, and I still don't have a full grasp on the whole scope of the system. I mean, obviously, it's a game. It's about vehicle combat, that kind of thing. But by having a full scope, I mean, I don't know all the ins and outs of how everything is interacting and working. So for me, this is a lot of this is not the be all and do all pass. This is like the second draft, and then I'm sure there's going to be a third draft and a fourth draft and a fifth draft as I start to actually wrap my head around all the ins and outs of what's going on here, and having never written a game of any kind of complexity before, I am really coming at it from a newbie perspective in that regard too. So that's why a lot of the videos are as long as they are. That's why the videos are kind of maybe less concise than a lot of people would like, and I get it. Your time is valuable, and I don't want to waste it. But at the same time, I feel like if you're really new to coding and stuff, sometimes it's helpful to see someone who's been doing this for years fall flat on their face and go down blind alleys and stuff like that, because none of us are immune to it. We all do it as we try to learn as we do things. And honestly, my learning usually revolves around me failing a lot and then finally succeeding. And that's usually how I learn best, is just by failing repeatedly and doing things, refactoring things and then realizing, oh, this is not going to work for this other instance, and then having to go back and rethink it. To me, that's the way that my brain works, and it works best for me that way. So I apologize if some of this is painful to watch from that perspective. I this is one of the reasons why I've waited so long to actually do any kind of programming stuff on this channel, because it's not the most interesting stuff to watch, especially when I'm not just jumping into the chase, as it were. But that said, I have off camera been looking at where I can get a few more like small victories, um, things that are kind of like building up my confidence that I know that where things are and how they're going on and all that stuff. Again, it's weird. As much as I might say that I'm refactoring this code base, I'm really not. I've gone well beyond the scope of refactoring at this point. At this point, I've broken everything, and now I'm trying to bring it back eventually to a point where it's buildable. This is the worst way to do it. This is one of those things where if you were to do something like this, something like what I'm doing in an actual like production, in a real software shop where you're getting paid to do it and not just a hobby on the side, you would be very, your bosses would be very unhappy. And honestly, it happens even to professionals. Like occasionally you'll look at something and go, I should really refactor this. And it looks pretty simple on the surface, and everything looks like it's going to fall into place. And then you get down into the weeds and realize, wow, this is a lot bigger than I had anticipated. Much, much bigger. And it happens to even the best coders out there, because sometimes you just don't know until you do it, until you start pulling things apart. And at that point, it behooves you to eat crow as fast as possible and just be like, hey boss, I made a mistake here. This was a lot bigger than I thought it would be. And at that point, then it becomes okay, we can get people to help you and all that stuff. So it's everybody ends up doing it at some point, no matter how good you are, no matter how much preparation and planning you do. Everyone ends up falling down that pit at some point, because there's it's just, 'tis the nature of the beast. But something like this would have raised flags much sooner. If I had taken on something like this in a professional environment where I was going to start refactoring things, it would have been from day one. I've been like, this is not just a refactoring, this is a rewrite. And it would have to be planned as such and all that stuff. So just bear all that in mind. I might use the word refactoring a lot because I'm just used to it, but this is well beyond the scope of a normal of something like that. So on those same that same line of thought, I thought, well, I'd like to peel off another little piece and see if I can make some progress forward. Try to get to a point where I've got like little pieces here and there that are compiling and that work and that have tests and stuff like that. Eventually we'll get to a point where we'll start to get momentum and all this stuff will start to compile and everything will start falling in place. But right now we're just kind of picking at the sides, at the ends. The pie is in front of us and we're just kind of like, taking little pieces of the crust stuff. So that no one else can enjoy the crust like we've enjoyed it. So that's where we're going. We're going from the outside in at this point, just because and it also helps me to be able to make smaller videos for you guys, so that I could just do one little thing here and there, not have 2 hours of me renaming stuff. So looking at a few of the things, two things kind of popped out at me. One is that I'd like to be able to take all the settings, the game settings, and which the game had everything as global pretty much, and so there's a lot of pieces of the code that look at the settings at various points because they were global variables and they could. And now I'm just trying to take that concept. I've made we made a Pojo of it a while ago. But I want to take it that extra route and say, I want to be able to load those settings up, once and have that, being available, to the rest of the system when it needs it. But I also want to be able to save those settings because, players like to be able to set things once in an options menu and then never have to set it again. So I thought I could do some of that. As well, because this kind of dovetails into it a little bit, I start looking at the keyboard and the mouse and seeing how I can then take all the keyboard keys and take the mouse keys and also make them part of the settings, because you can, rebind them potentially, and also kind of get all those things that are like global stuff, because these are options. They're things that drive the display. They're things that drive the input. They're things that drive, the physics and all that stuff. So they getting this kind of wrapping this up into something that's easily accessible but also easily maintainable would be a really good thing, and also would allow me to start testing it and knowing that there's yet another large piece of the pie that is working. So when I had last looked at this keyboard enum here, this is the original keyboard enum that this was the original keyboard enum that we ended up pulling out of the main class and making its own file. I had noted that scene here, which is an error because it's a global, it doesn't have visibility right now, was the JavaFX packages scene. So basically over in VE Java here, a scene is set up right here, and I think if I do Control-Shift-G, it should tell me where. Yeah, start stage. Here it is. So here we create a new scene, and this is a stack pane. You don't have to know the innards and outwards of JavaFX, but basically the scene is the encompassing invisible box that where all of the graphics canvas is the graphics context and stuff, but scene is like the invisible box that contains where all your input goes and your various sprites and things like that, I believe. And animations, I believe, are based off the scene or the stage. Oh yeah, the stage is like, there's weird things here. Like there's a stage and then the scene sits on top of the stage, and then that's where your graphics kind of go into the scene. And then as you switch scenes, your graphics switch in the stage. It's the way that they have it encapsulated as far as JavaFX is concerned. So this scene is where we actually have to grab the input from the user. Now, because this was global, it was very easy to have these enums kind of hanging around that was just like keyboard and mouse, and it just kind of, they just looked at the scene and then they registered themselves. If we go back to keyboard.java here, you see it looks, all right, I see the scene. I'm going to register. I'm going to say, whenever there's a key event coming in, get me the code from it and let me do my stuff here. And from a basic perspective, this is a relatively black box, right? I mean, to a certain extent, it's doing all the things around a keyboard. It's getting the key codes that came in, and it's setting some variables, and then based on those variables, someone else who is going to process those keyboard variables, like the boost and this was pressed and that was pressed, will be able to just look at this enum and say, oh, this has been pressed, this has been pressed, that's been pressed, this has been pressed, this is this is what we got to do. Here's where the art of development comes in rather than the science. So, we're all programmers. Programmers are considered to be scientists, but really, when you get down to it, about 30% of what we do is actually science, and 70% is more art. The art of writing maintainable code. And this is where you'll get the most disagreements, and for valid reasons. Encapsulation always tends to be that one thing that it's, depending on what you're doing, it could mean one thing versus another. What I've heard a lot of, and I don't know if these are actual defined terms or not, but I've heard a lot of high touch versus low touch stuff. I've heard people talk about that a lot. Now, my understanding, and again, my understanding could be wrong, is that high touch means that you've got basically what the situation is here. You've got a global variable that's set, and everybody and their grandmother's got to come in and just use it and abuse it and just register themselves and just get in there on that pie. In and of itself, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that approach. What ends up happening, though, when you have so many hands in the pie is that if you do want to refactor later on, you want to move something around, there's a lot more moving pieces that have to be fixed when that does that. Or if the API that you're using suddenly deprecates, say if set on key pressed was deprecated and no longer takes a key event, it takes something else. That's a bunch of different areas of the system now that might be all over the place, that now have to change to reflect that. If you were to update, the JavaFX libraries and stuff. And in some cases, you're dealing with a library that doesn't give you a different option. So sometimes you just have to use what you got. Like sometimes, I'm lucky in that JavaFX has handlers and interfaces and stuff. So there is an alternative to the way this is written that I'll show you in a minute. But in many cases, you'll run up, especially if it's a third-party library that is not community supported, you'll run across things that are just like, well, there is no better way to do this. Everything's a concrete implementation, so I gotta just deal with what I got. And in that case, you end up probably writing a wrapper around it to try to centralize as much of that crud as you can into one area, so that if you ever do have to refactor it due to an upgrade or something like that, it's relatively contained in one section. What I tend to do, in most cases, I tend to take a more low-touch approach to things. I like to not have so much of the system dependent on global variables and trying to manipulate the various scenes and stuff like that. I try to make it so that the dependencies that I have on the framework that I'm using use the best mechanism for their dependency, or they're dependent, maybe from a hierarchical standpoint rather than from a direct, concrete standpoint. So that was a long-winded way of me saying set on key pressed here takes a key event. What I've done is, if I go to this new class, keyboard bindings, you'll see, actually, I'm sorry, that's the wrong one. If I go to, what is it? Keyboard input event, yes. You'll see that I implement event handler now, event handler key events. And there's a handle method here, which I haven't written yet. But basically what this is, event handler comes from JavaFX, and it is an interface. You can see it says at functional interface. And it's taking key events that come in. What this allows me to do, basically, is over here, you see on the keyboard, we have set on key pressed. We'll set on key pressed if it'll give me the pop-up, maybe, possibly. Let's see if I can get it this way. Nope, that's not it. Anyway, set on key pressed takes a handler. Right now, you don't see the handler because they've done an inner, they've done a lambda here, which basically is a shorter basically an inner implementation, inner class kind of thing, only a little bit fancier. So they've got an anonymous inner class, essentially, in this case a lambda, which is acting as the handler. So when the JVM comes across here, it will actually spin up a handler class, but it won't have a name. It'll be some generated name, internal name. And then this code will then registers itself immediately. So basically think of this as being, instead of creating a class and then having all this stuff reference that class, you've basically taken all that class creation and everything and just kind of bunched it into one method call. This is very, very common for handlers, particularly in Swing and JavaFX, where you've got this, this thing takes a handler and you want it to, you need to handle the keys coming in, you need to handle an enter key, you need to handle a submit, that kind of thing. It's also very prominent on like web forms and stuff like that. So this is something you'd see a lot of. So I'm not surprised to see this at all. What I've decided to do, for better or for worse, because I haven't quite figured out if this is going to help or if this is going to hinder, what I decided to do is actually pull this out into its own class. And that's where the keyboard inputs, where is that? Input event comes in. So I'm implementing event handler. And the idea here is that we're going to do basically the logic that was in there, and more or less the logic that we saw in the Lambda earlier, taking in the key event and setting some various variables and whatnot. And then what we'll do is, instead of having to pass the JavaFX scene around and making that a big global variable that everybody has to know about, everybody who cares about setting handlers and stuff on has to be aware of. Instead, in the VE class here, when we go to initialize stuff, right, instead of, when we create the scene, I'll basically say, scene dot set or add, where's the thing out here? Set on key pressed, and then I'll give it an instance of this keyboard input event and say, here, use this. And the same thing with the mouse. And then that way, all that stuff is sort of encapsulated now into a class, into a package, and I can worry about the keyboard input event. Just worries about itself. It doesn't have to worry about how it's being. It doesn't have to worry about the scene. It doesn't have to worry that the scene has been created, because again, a global variable, you got to make sure that you call it after the global variable's been initialized. In this case, it doesn't even have to worry about it. It's just, it knows it'll get called when it's ready to be called. It also gives you a little more flexibility in, say, later on, if we decide to have a controller or joystick input, right? Well, what happens if, there is no joystick present, or maybe the joystick was present when they first played the game, but then they unplugged it, right? Well, in a perfect world, you would fall back to a keyboard and mouse immediately. And this kind of gives you that ability a little bit easier, because now you can just say, oh, I've registered these handlers, but they'll just never get called anymore. It'll just fall back to the last one. And I don't have to manually say, oh, this is now a thing or that's now a thing. Usually, we'll see how that works in actual practice, if that's really the case or not. But as I started to do this, I realized I want to be able to have the user save their settings and save their bindings. And some of these keyboard bindings I'm not quite sure what some of them do yet. Obviously, we know what up, down, left, right and stuff does, and WASD. But there's things like, Z is doing something with the camera, X is doing something with the camera. We've got these various digits, which are different views, it looks like different fixed views. And this is working on the camera view, so I'm guessing this is like a zoom in and zoom out. So based on what I'm seeing, I've kind of tried to guess as to what the keys are doing. That's not to say that I've guessed correctly, but I've tried to come up with the best explanations I can as to what's going on. Obviously, there's a volume control here, and then there's brightness changes, and there's an info, and then there's a mute key to mute the sound altogether. Then there's a shift and control, which does some kind of zoom change, but I don't know exactly what that means because there's another one up here that does something very similar, it feels like, or this changes to whatever camera. Maybe this is, I think I have these set as changing the different views, like cycling through the views rather than using the digits. And then this one is actually doing a zoom, maybe. I'm not sure because it sets it to a particular number. So I was also thinking like maybe this means this is boost, but then boost is actually B from what I can tell. So I don't know. I've done the best that I can do as far as not knowing how these things are actually used later on. So with that said, I made what was it? Input operations, I believe. This is just a regular enum right now, and trying to encapsulate all the different things that I've seen. And based on what I've seen, I've tried to kind of figure out what to call these things, like switch perspective, HUD toggle, destruction log toggle, view watch cinematic, change view next, change view previous, brightness up, brightness down, volume up, volume down. I also put a to-do in here that I might need some deflection-based inputs based on the mouse, to know that, hey, we're now positive X versus negative X, Z, and all that stuff. I'm not sure exactly yet what I need there because I haven't looked at the mouse class too closely, but that's why I kind of threw this here just in case. So this encapsulates what operation has happened. But then there's the idea of, well, I need to know what key happened, right? And then I need to map whatever key happened to the appropriate operation. And that's where things get tricky because the operation could be different based on what's on screen. Like if you're in the menus, WASD and the arrow keys probably should work to move you around the menus and navigate the menus. Whereas if you're controlling your car, those things should actually control the car in theory. So there's a context here that I haven't quite figured out how to bring together yet. And that's something I'm going to try to figure out today. But also there's the idea that you can rebind these things. And I feel like rebinding is important enough. I wanted to do it. Also, because I need to save settings anyway, this kind of kills two birds with one stone, sort of. So then I got it. So then I thought, well, let's get the options done because it's very similar to what we've done before with the external strings. And so I so we had the game options method that we created a while ago. It's just a class with just a bunch of properties in it. And what I've done is to make an options loader, and I've started this, but I haven't finished it necessarily yet. What this will do is it will use the Java properties, Java util properties, to read a settings properties file. Settings properties file is basically set up the same way that we saw the external strings, where it's just like something equals something. This is the property, and this is the value that it's set to. Now you'll notice in here I've set the values to constants. I've made the constants the same as the ones that we saw in the keyboard class here, because these are coming off a key code, which is a JavaFX scene. Luckily, as you can see by my rolling over there, that is an enumeration because it's got the little brown E with like a flag on it, which is very, very useful for us. If this hadn't been an enumeration, we'd have to do a little bit of extra work. But because this is an enumeration, I don't have to use reflection to grab the stuff. I can just use name, and I'll be able to get I'll be able to map the name that I've read from the file to directly to the key code and get that enumeration back, and then be able to deal with it in a more generic way, so to speak. So that makes our life a little bit easier, because now, as long as whoever's modifying this file uses the correct enumerated type, will be fine. Now, this is one of those things where I'm not necessarily expecting users to come in here and start mucking with things. So, although they could. So one of the things I haven't done yet is the ability to resave your properties here. It's actually something I haven't done ever. Because normally, I work on web-based systems that run on servers, and normally your properties files are just read-only, and that's that. And if something needs a change in there, an administrator goes on the box and they change it, and that's it. You don't usually change it from a user interface. So I believe that there is a way to do this. Having never done it, I don't know what it is yet, so I'm going to have to do a little bit of looking up, and a little bit of API, looking through Java docs to see how this would work and whether or not I can dump it out. I believe in theory it is possible to redump out the properties to a file after they've been manipulated by a UI. I'm hoping that it will put them back into the file in the same order that they were read out of. Otherwise, that could get a little bit frustrating to someone who is looking at the file and going, okay, now everything's in a random order. Like, this doesn't make any sense. If that's not the case, if there's no way for me to write these properties back out in some kind of, maintaining the order, I always have the fallback position of I can bring, say, Jackson down, the Jackson library down, and write it out as JSON to the file. And I know you're probably saying, well, wait, why JSON? Why not just use a serialization? Everything, you can implement serializable and have Java just write out a binary file. I tend to stray away from writing out of binary files, mostly because I want the users to be able to manipulate this if for some reason the game got them into a spot where it's not even launching. B, and we'll come into this if there's some kind of progression saving and stuff. I don't see any need to prevent users from being able to, say, if we have save files, save scum and stuff like that. I mean, yes, there's a multiplayer aspect to this, but I can't imagine that save scumming would allow them to have some kind of, save file manipulation would give them any kind of leg up on the competition per se, unless it's like they've unlocked all the cars, like big deal. I don't know if any of that is even in the game right now. To me, it seems like it's just a straightforward, multiplayer game. Everything's unlocked from the beginning, and it's just that. And if there was any save file, it would be like, here's your statistics, and you can go manipulate them all you want. So that's just my thoughts on that. There is like a binary form of JSON as well that you can do, like JSON-B, I think it is. But the reason I stray from doing straight serialization is that you now tie that file to the implementation of your class. And if you are, if you're still developing the game, and say you do like an early access thing and you give an early alpha out to people, and you're still developing your game, what you're basically doing then is, if you then later on add stuff to that file, to the save file, you've now pretty much invalidated everyone's save files everywhere. So if they, all your players have been playing the game for a while, and all of a sudden they get an update and now their save files can't load and everything like that, that's a little bit frustrating. And that happens. It happens a lot. There's a lot of people playing early access games realize that, oh yeah, my save file is no longer viable. I can't do anything with it. That's one of the reasons why I sort of advocate for like something that's text based, like throwing JSON in there or something like that, because that gives you a little bit more flexibility. If you're writing out JSON blobs, you can, there's still situations that you can get into where, a save file is no longer valid, but if you're just adding properties or removing properties from a class that's then being converted to JSON and saved, you basically have built-in backwards compatibility, because if a save file has those other properties in it, they just won't be read, they'll just be ignored. So that's kind of the tit for tat as far as which way to go with that. I've done a lot of talking and no coding, and I apologize, but I wanted, there was a lot of stuff, a lot of ground to cover here. I still quite haven't figured out how I'm going to tie all these together yet. I do have a test around this. I do know that I can read the file. I have an options loader test here, and it does in fact read the file. I can even say that I can try to read a key that doesn't exist, and it doesn't exist. I get a false back for that on contains key. And I get multiple keys back and all that stuff. The test is pretty straightforward and simple. The reason this test isn't any more complicated than this is because I'm using a Java util property, and basically the JVM has its own set of rigorous Java tests. So I'm really just to write more tests means that I'm basically replicating tests that probably already exist under the covers in JVM. I'm not really testing my code at that point. I'm now testing the JVM, that the JVM works, and pretty sure the JVM is working okay. So that's why it's just super, super basic here, and not anything beyond that. This becomes an issue when you work at companies that say you need to have you need to maintain 80% code coverage or something like that. That's where you got to maintain a certain percentage of code, covered, that you start seeing tests that basically exercise the JVM for some god awful reason. Just because someone said a magic number of 80%, and you need to get to that 80%, even if it doesn't make any sense to do so. So it's just one of those things you'll encounter in the real world that will make you rage, and hopefully go home and drink quite heavily at times. So you can see here, I'm just pulling the options file name, settings, properties, and opening a stream, doing an options.load on it. Now, there's an important thing here. I do an open stream, right? Now, you look at the Java doc for this, and it says down here somewhere, it says equivalent to get input stream. I think, is this the one that says it? No, there's one here that says this does not, I think it's this one. Yeah. So you see on option file here, which is the input stream, it says this closes the input stream and releases any system resources. The close method of input stream does nothing. And you might read that and go, well, if it does nothing, then I shouldn't have to call it, right? But in reality, you do, because this is opening a stream. It's not opening necessarily, it's opening something that implements input stream, because input stream is just an abstract, it's actually an abstract class. And load specifically tells you, when you look at it here, The specified stream remains open after this method returns. So you got to be very careful that you read everything, because this is basically telling you better freaking close this stream when you're done, or else you're going to have an open file stream that's just going to keep consuming. That's going to consume resources, operating system resources, and then until eventually your system, your application closes, or you end up calling open again and again and again and running out of file handles and then causing a hard crash, which will then really shut you down. So that's the whole jumping through hoops here that I've done. And of course, since it's a stream, make sure that, when I call close, I got to protect against a null pointer. And even calling close can cause an IO exception, so you got to kind of, protect against that. I've left the to-dos in here because eventually we're not going to be doing e.print stack trace and all this stuff. We're going to have an actual logging framework that will log stuff into one place, but that'll be a task for later. So this just gets me to game options that already exist. This is just the read portion of it. Now the question is, can I write options back out, and can they, maintain their order and stuff that they were read in, so that, we're not just randomly polluting this file, the settings properties file. We're actually doing stuff. And that's where I need to go and start do some research. So I will do that, and I will be right back. Okay, friends. So I'm back, and it's not entirely what I was hoping for, but I think upon further examination, I think it's acceptable for now. You can, in fact, save properties. There is a store method. There's also a save method, but it's deprecated because it doesn't throw an IO exception like it's supposed to. So you want to use the store method on the properties, which is right here. Let's see. Store will take either an output. There's two different overrides of it. One that takes an output stream, one that takes a writer. I'm using a writer because that's actually the more, I guess, modern way of doing things, readers and writers. The only reason I use an input stream out here is because it was so freaking easy to get it. Sometimes laziness dictates the best approach to things sometimes. In this case, I had to actually fire up a file and get a file writer going, and then tell it to store there. The other parameter is just a comment. The comment, I believe, appears at the top. I'm just passing it null because I have no real comment to put into the properties file. But when it's null, I think it just puts the last time and date that it was updated in there, if I'm not mistaken. If I look at our settings properties now, yeah, it'll tell you when it last updated and all that stuff, which is good enough for me. The thing is, and you'll notice it right away here, it's in a random order. The stuff. Now it's hard to tell right now because all I have in here is the keyboard stuff, but once I add in mouse stuff and other options, you'll see they'll all get jumbled up together. It's not the best way that I would want it to be. I would like it to maintain the order that was there, but at the same time, it's so easy that I'm kind of like, yeah, I guess this will just have to do. In a perfect world, users won't have to actually edit that file at all. It'll just all be available in the UI. So, yeah, it is what it is. It's not the most ideal way of having it, but I kind of have to live with it. The reason it's in a random order, and I'll take a moment to explain this. If we look at the properties class, the Java util properties, you'll see that it implements hash table. Hash table is the Java equivalent of, if you're a .NET programmer, it's pretty much conceptually, It's the Java equivalent of a dictionary. In fact, it actually implements dictionary. Essentially, a hash table is a key value pair table where the keys are not allowed to be null, essentially. The implementation is a little bit different under the covers, but that's conceptually, from a high level, the difference between that and a hash map, which you'll see I use a lot and a lot of Java developers use a lot, which allows for null keys. Even though, and this is the funny part about that, even though most of us never actually use null keys, we still tend to use hash maps a lot. It's easier to write. Sometimes laziness wins out in the day. Also, there's a lot more implementations of hash map that are desirable. Hash table, the way it stores things, it has some sort of algorithm that it uses to store things in memory, so it doesn't preserve the order in which it read things, which is why when I go and tell properties, since it comes off of hash table, to go save themselves, it saves it in whatever order it happened to save them. It happened to load them into memory. And that order is as far as I understand, is non-deterministic. So it could be in some random order, just whatever the JVM felt like doing at that time. If this were just if it had come off of just, say, map, for instance, or a linked hash map, then it would have maintained an order. A linked hash map tends to maintain the order of the keys, and then when it would go to write them out, it would write them out in the same order that it read them in, and there wouldn't be this kind of funkiness. But yeah, it's not the worst thing in the world. I would rather I'd be able to write them out that way, but then to go and write the code to do that, which is a little bit more difficult, I figured my time's probably better spent not worrying about it so much. So that's where we stand on that. I've also written the test for it. Let's bring up the test. Where are my tests at? Where are my tests at? Here they are. Options deliver test. So you see where we last left off, we were here, test missing property. I have the test save new properties, and I've done it in a different way. So I've got, instead of using the properties that get loaded before each here, in this case, I've loaded the properties up myself. And I've done that because I want to be able to restore the properties file back to the way I found it, because we're actually doing, in this case, we're not doing a unit test. This is where our tests have now strayed into integration testing, where we're actually making actual calls that will change things. Now, in a perfect world, I would go in and start grabbing jmock, and I would mock up the save so that it actually didn't do this save for real. In this case, I actually wanted to test that it was actually going to physically do it to the drive and what it looked like. So I made this an integration test where it actually physically makes changes. But because I'm physically making changes, I need to make sure that I put the file back the way I found it. So what I've done is I've loaded the options here into a properties object. I add in a new property, a test property, save it. So it saves out to the file because it's doing the actual save. Loading the properties back up again, checking to see if that exists in there. If it does, then this assert true is correct. It'll contain the key. And then I do a get property on it, and I say, does this key equal this string that I put in? If it does, then this passes, and then we call cleanup. Cleanup basically goes to the loaded options, which is the class property here that is set up before each test. And since this guy has already been set up and is already in memory, he doesn't have the changes that I just made in this test save new properties. So basically I'm saying go save this back out to the disk, and then I just to make sure that everything is still on the up and up, I load those back in again into another properties file, and I check to make sure that the size of the properties I loaded in equals the size of the properties I just saved, just to be absolutely pedantic to make sure that it actually did in fact save and didn't have some kind of error along the way, like a file exception or something like that. Which, if there was an exception along the way, it would have thrown that error anyway, but I just wanted to be absolutely pedantic about it. And then, so that's a new property, and then I have a test here that says test the saving of an existing property, where I change an existing property that I know is going to be there, in this case keyboard up. I change it to P instead of W, and I save it, then I load that back up, make sure that it equals, and if it does, then I do and call cleanup again. Pretty straightforward. That should make hopefully a lot of sense what I've done there, I hope. That's so we now have it where I can load a properties file, load the settings from disk, and I can save them, which means we can then integrate this with the larger game options thing that I have here, which is driver seat position, match length, units, and all this stuff. Some of these we don't need to save. Like the match length, I don't think is a setting that you would save to disk. That seems like something that's just it's gonna default to something, and then they can just change it. It's going to be changeable a lot, and it's not changeable necessarily from the options menu. It's changeable from whenever you start up a match. So that I wouldn't save. But the driver seat position, we could definitely save. The units definitely seems like something to be saved. Normal mapping, heads up display, yes or no. That one's kind of an iffy one. That one I could see us not saving it and just always having it default to true, and then they just have to turn it off when they don't want it, because that doesn't seem like something that needs to be saved across sessions. We'll see. I could see an argument either way on that one. Degraded sound effects, I think is something that we can save. And show info is not. Show info is not. That would just be I think that's just a general holding place for stuff here. I'm not too concerned with that. So I think there's a couple of things that we can save. I think definitely saving units, definitely saving the normal mapping, the great sound effects, and the driver seat position are probably the ones that we want to actually save to this settings. So I will do that right now. I mean, really all that involves is me just putting those into the file. We don't actually have I don't have a thing that actually loads them up yet. I mean, it'll load up with all the other properties. I don't have a thing that will actually set them in the game options yet, but we can at least load them. So what I can do is just say, we'll say, let's see, driver seat position. We'll do it live. Why not? Driver seat position. So we'll say, options dot driver seat position equals, and you'll see that I'm not doing capitals in here. The only reason I did capitals with this is because those are enumerations, and the same with the value. The value is capital there because it's enumeration. Although values don't really matter, but these are all an enumeration, so I kept them this way so that I could reference them directly. This one here is ultimately a driver seat position is an enumeration, but I'm not concerned with it. It's not going to be like, I'm not trying to do a reflection or something like that, or get name on the enumeration. I'm just going to read it in and just set it based on what I've read in, which means the value will be capitalized because I'm going to do a get name on the value to set it. I know a lot of this probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it'll make a little bit more sense once we actually write the code that reads this stuff. Where's my game options at? Here it is. Let's move these next to one another so I can see them. All right. So we default to center, so I'm just going to put it as center here. like so. We'll do options dot, what was the other one? Units. We'll say units equals, and then we'll set that to, I think was the default, VEs. So we'll just default it to VEs. Oop, is that how that? Yeah, that is how it is. Okay. I might change that at some point, but we're not worried about it right now. Normal mapping. So options, that normal mapping. We'll set to true. And yeah, that sounds. See, I'm kind of looking at this going, should I call them options? Or should I just, but I guess at this point it doesn't really matter. Because there's not that many that are going to get set. I was thinking like maybe I should categorize them, like I categorize the keyboard, but you know what? There's not enough of them to justify it, I don't think. And then options dot degraded sound effects is what we'll just call it. Degraded sound effects was false. We'll save that, and then it's just a matter of reading those in. I mean, it's a matter of setting those. They're already going to be read in when the options loader is fired up. That's my test. Right? Where's my? They're already going to be loaded in when the options loader is loaded, or called, I should say. You notice too that I made these static because why not? There's no reason to have to fire up the options loader. You just basically just call what you're going to call and bring them back. There's no reason for this to hold any kind of state that I can tell. I mean, maybe I'll find a reason for it to have some sort of state later on, but right now it's mostly just a utility class. And it might as well just be a utility class by having all the static methods in there. So we can just call it directly. So that said, those properties get loaded up, then they have to get set into the appropriate areas, which means we're going to have somewhere, probably up in the VE class here, we'll be actually doing an options loader dot get game options, and then disseminating those options out to the various beans that they need to be set in. Not necessarily at that point yet, but that'll be where we'll go with that. And that should be pretty straightforward, so there's no reason for me to do that at the moment. Right now, what I'd like to do is to wire up the parts of the keyboard input handler that I haven't done yet. So I'm going to get on that, but I'm probably going to put a cut here and do that as another episode. So thanks so much for watching, everybody, and I will see you next time.